My name is Mike Palmer, Restoration Ecologist at APCC, and I'm going to be talking about a project today that restored two different cranberry bog cells to brook trout habitat, along with accomplishing some other restoration objectives. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge all the many project partners. None of these restoration projects at this scale happen with one group or one person. It takes a team, and teamwork makes the dream work, and this project was certainly no exception. What I'm going to be talking about today is the results that we've collected and reported on in a 3-year post-construction report. And I say post-construction as something that I'm going to emphasize later on the talk is that this is not a post-restoration report. The restoration is still going on. A lot of these large-scale restoration efforts are not set it and forget it type of projects. And so we need to make sure that we keep a long-term view of these things. And so I use the term post-construction report very intentionally. But anyway, this was a report that was funded through Mass DER with contributions from the White Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, Falmouth Rod and Gun Club, Mass Wildlife, the Woodwell Climate Center, as well as others. We completed this report last year. It's now available on the APCC website through that QR code up there. And this simply builds on the 1-year post-construction report that was completed back in 2023. And all of that information associated with the Childs River restoration project is available on APCC's website at that URL right there. So a little bit of background about the Childs River. It's located on the southern side of Cape Cod. It's a cold groundwater-fed stream flowing into Wacoit Bay. It starts in the town of Mashpee and flows south into Falmouth before emptying into Wacoit Bay. It has a history of sea-run brook trout. This is what makes the stream so important and so unique, is that it has this population of brook trout that are capable of migrating into salt water where they grow to sometimes abnormally large sizes, but most of the time in our coastal streams, they're relatively small. But they're very unique and beautiful fish. And somebody alluded to in the last session about canaries in the coal mine. And brook trout are one of our canaries in the coal mine for our freshwater streams. They need some pristine cold water habitat in order to thrive. And that's what we were trying to restore at the Childs River in Falmouth and Mashpee. And the reason why we were doing this restoration is because this area had a extensive history of land use dating back to the mid-1800s. There, where that dam impoundment label is, there was a dam that was installed there down near Carriage Shop Road that you can see down in the lower right-hand corner. And the dam was there to power a millworks that existed in the mid-1800s. There was also, during that same time, there was a artificial herring run that was created by digging a ditch from the Garner Bog up to John's Pond that allowed herring to go from Wacoit Bay up to John's Pond. In the 1900s, similar to other places on Cape Cod, there was a shift away from millworks into cranberry agriculture, and we saw a lot of the river valley of the Childs River area being transitioned to cranberry farming. There was a bog cell called the Farley Bog in the middle of the river system, and then further north in the Mashpee area, another cranberry bog cell called the Garner Bog. The impacts of all this cranberry bog farming, as well as the millworks and the associated anthropogenic modifications over the years, resulted in ditching and sanding of the bog surface, a transition to a monoculture across the bog surfaces where we had a cranberry monoculture. Warm water impoundments caused by the dams led to warming of the water system. A failed fish ladder feeding into the dam didn't allow fish passage from the lower portion of the river system up to the northern portion of the river system. And all of those things were detrimental to the habitat of species like sea-run brook trout. So the restoration timeline, I show this slide just to kind of guide your eye as to how long these sorts of restoration projects took. I apologize that some of the wording is a little bit blurry, but the take-home point is that these projects take a long time. Falmouth Rod and Gun Club just started thinking about this project in 2014, and it took 7 years from the initial visioning of the project to the end of the construction period in 2021. And so this is a multi-step, multi-year process involving large groups of teams in order to accomplish these things. And even after the restoration the construction is completed in 2021, there's still post-construction monitoring going on to determine how well the restoration succeeded and what sorts of adaptive management needs to happen after the fact. So that was one of the things that I wanted to emphasize, was that even once the construction is done, the restoration is still ongoing, in the sense that there is this ongoing monitoring and there is an adaptive management component to these large-scale restoration projects. They're not just set it and forget it type projects. So there were 4 focal points, or 4 goals of the restoration objective in Childs River. The first was to improve coldwater habitat for species like brook trout and enhance fish passage, address some of the barriers that were prohibiting brook trout from getting from the southern reaches into those northern reaches up past the failed dam and failed fish ladder. We also were trying to improve water quality as well as restore wetlands habitat diversity. These 2 objectives were not front and center to the brook trout restoration, so I'm not going to talk about them a lot in this talk, but they are, if you go to that 3-year report, they are talked about in that 3-year report. So with respect to the coldwater habitat and fish passage, how do we go about evaluating that? What were the metrics that we looked at in order to evaluate the level of success? One, we had continuous temperature loggers distributed throughout the river system, north to south. We conducted, with the support of Mass Wildlife, biannual brook trout electrofishing surveys, where we would get fish abundance information as well as information on fish length and fish weight. And just about every brook trout that was caught during that survey was tagged with a small passive integrative transponder tag, or PIT tag. And it's a small transponder about the size of a grain of rice, and it gets injected. This is a picture of Steve Hurley here over on the left-hand side, using a syringe to inject that PIT tag into the abdomen of a brook trout. And so those three methods were what we used to monitor the response of this system with respect to temperature and fish habitat and fish abundance. So first, to talk a little bit about temperature. This is really the secret to restoring habitat on the Childs River. And these are 6 temperature plots going from north to south. So the Garner outlet is the northernmost bog cell in the river system. Above Farley Bog is next, and then down above Barrow Street in the lower right is the one that's down in the tidal section of the river, just above Quoit Bay. And what I want to guide you to is, one is in the upper left-hand plot, there's a break in the time series, and that's when the construction was happening in that section. And then above in Rod Gun Club ponds, you see another break in the time series. That's where construction was happening in that area, and that's when the probe was removed. So what you can look at is the before and after response. What was the temperature response before construction, and then what was the temperature response after construction? And what you can see, and just to follow your eyes there, that red band there is the optimal thermal habitat for brook trout. So it's about a window from about 55 degrees to 61 degrees, their take. They can certainly experience habitat warmer than that, but that is the sweet spot for brook trout. And the take-home point, particularly for the middle 2 plots, above Rod and Gun Club ponds and below Rod and Gun Club ponds, that area there really experienced a significant improvement in the temperature thermal regime following construction. And that we had these wide swings in high temperatures and low temperatures in the wintertime, high temperatures in the summertime. After construction was completed, we had a much smaller range of temperatures that were exhibited. And that was definitely, we're spending more of the year within that thermal optimum for brook trout. A couple other take-home points were at Garner Bog in Mashpee, even after restoration, we still don't have temperatures that are suitable for brook trout. There's just not enough groundwater flow in the northern section of the restoration project area in order to support brook trout habitat up there. But once you get down to the Farley Bog system, you start to see marked improvements in the temperature signals post-construction. And from Farley Bog south, we saw a very significant improvement in brook trout habitat. So this is really exemplified, or that point is really exemplified by the surveys that we did. So I mentioned we did biannual electrofishing surveys. This is one plot showing the results from our fall surveys. And I would stress, don't take too much into the absolute levels of these. These results here are not designed to show abundance in each of the sections, but more just presence and absence. And so what I want to highlight here is that prior to the restoration in 2020 and 2019, brook trout were primarily in the lower river portion, below that dam, below that failed fish ladder. That was about the only place that we saw brook trout in the system prior to the restoration construction happening in 2021. Following the restoration, we started seeing brook trout showing up in the former pond area just north of the fish dam, as well as in the Farley Bog, that first cranberry cell just north of the impoundment. And then we saw the brook trout persisting year after year in all three of those sections. One of the things that we got from the pit tags was we got some information about residency. I mentioned these were sea-run brook trout, so they have the capacity of boogieing on out of the system, going into the ocean and swimming into a nearby tributary if they wanted to. So what we saw, though, that wasn't what happened. Most of the brook trout that we caught in the system stayed in the system. This is an example of a brook trout that was caught up in the Farley Bog. That is a pit tag antenna in the Farley Bog over there on the right-hand corner. And what we saw with this brook trout, which sort of exemplifies the patterns that we saw, is the brook trout, once they were released in the northern sections, they made some forays down into the southern areas, but by and large, they stayed in the river system. We found 80% of the fish continued to stay within the river system and utilize that habitat, which tells us that post-restoration, this was really a success story, that these brook trout seemed to prefer to stay in these habitats. One other thing we saw was with fish length, we could see fish recruitment, and we could see those cohorts tracking over time. And this is a plot of the length frequencies over time, again from the fall survey, and you can see it in 2022, 2023, and 2024 going down. And what I'm showing here is those are age zeros showing up in the top corner of that red line. And then we see them again the next year as age ones, and we finally in age twos, and they start to disappear. We see fewer and fewer of them each year as they die of natural mortality. But this allows us to track a cohort across years. And what it demonstrates is the presence of juvenile fish, that's spawning success. We have successful spawning going on in the Childs River. And it also gives us some estimation of the annual survival of these fish. The other thing that we could do with the biological data collected from the survey is look at the fish weights. And when we compared it to the nearby river systems that were also restored cranberry bogs, like the Coonamessett River to the west and the Quashnet River to the east, what we saw were that the fish weights were generally in line with the fish weights that we were seeing from these other nearby systems. In fact, they were just a little bit heavier at a particular length. Is that the Childs River fish seem to be a little bit fatter than their neighboring brook trout populations. And that could be for any variety of reasons. It could be that there's more food availability, macroinvertebrate population might be higher. But by and large, they were consistent with what we saw with the other river systems, but maybe just a hair fatter. The one other take-home point that I want to stress, though, the Childs River is in green. One thing that you notice in this plot is that you don't see as many large old fish in the Childs River relative to the Coonamessett and Quashnet. The fish just don't seem to be growing as old in the Childs River. And we're not quite sure why that is. I think the leading theory right now is that it's a younger river system and there's not as much habitat for the brook trout to hide from predators. So possibly the predation mortality is a little bit higher. Predation stress is a little bit higher in the Childs River than these other systems. That's a working hypothesis we have right now. I did want to talk about continued challenges, though. One of the biggest challenges we have in this river system is sedimentation. As a very young restoration project, there was a lot of organic matter on the bog surfaces that as that bog matured, a lot of that organic matter ended up in the rivers. And so the Falmouth Rod and Gun Club has had to stay on top of the sedimentation challenge. During the construction of the restored river, they actually put in a couple of sediment dumps or sediment traps that were designed to trap a lot of these organics that were getting washed down. And they go out and they continually maintain these several times since the restoration. They've had to go out and use a bucket loader to pull those organics out. So it's a constant challenge that has to be maintained. If you don't do that, you get excessive vegetation, which clogs the system and then leads to more sedimentation. So it's a vicious cycle. So with that, I just want to conclude and say that, what we saw with Childs River was that cold water habitat was restored. We see stream temperatures that are now conducive to brook trout populations. We see fish passage improved. We see the northern areas are now being restored by brook trout. And there's definitely evidence of spawning and survival, multi-year overwintering survival. Fish seem to be thriving. They seem to be in excellent condition. But then to highlight that ongoing stewardship of the river is a continual need in these types of projects. And then just a reminder that these restoration projects aren't just about the fish and the wildlife, they're also about the people. And Childs River has a really nice area for recreation as well. So with that, I thank you.
Thanks. We have enough time for a few questions. Great.
Hi. Yes, I have a question regarding the post-construction. You talked about a sediment trap. Is there an operations and maintenance plan and a permitting pathway for being able to clean out that sediment trap that you described? If you could just talk a little bit more about that.
That's a great question, and I have to feign complete ignorance on that. I don't know whether there's an operation and maintenance plan for those sediment traps, and that's a step that's really been done primarily by the Falmouth Rod and Gun Club post-construction, so I'm not as intimately familiar with that, so I honestly can't speak to that, unfortunately.